What if I told you that everybody has SEC bias? What if I told you that all of us actually are very aware that the SEC is the best division in football, but we don't want to admit it because if we admit that, then what that means for our teams isn't very good. So we all have SEC bias and the committee has SEC bias. You watching this, if you're a fan of anybody, of any team that's not in the SEC, you also have SEC bias. You want to know how I know that? Think for a second. Do you want your team to play Georgia? Do you want your team to play Tennessee? Do you want your team to play Texas? Do you think your team has better trenches than Georgia? Do you think your team has better trenches than Alabama? If the answer to that question is no, you also have SEC bias. Your biases are just a little bit different though, because the biases that you have towards the SEC don't actually help your case. But you also are very aware of what you're watching. And when you watch these football games, you are very aware of what conference has the best trenches, which conference has the teams that you don't want to play in it. We're all aware of it. We all know because those are the players that get drafted into the NFL at the highest rate. And you can't say on one end the NFL matters very much and that's the goal and only the best players go there. And then the league that is putting the best players into that division, you say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. They're not the best. We all know the SEC is the best. We all have biases. I'm going to take time and I'm going to explain to you about these biases and why you have them and why even though it pains you deep down inside, you have to admit the SEC is the best football conference top to bottom. It just is what it is. I'm going to get to this video. I'm going to explain to you my why. I'm also going to agree with one thing probably at the very end of this video, but overall, we all have SEC biases the same. We all know what's up when it comes to the SEC, even if we don't want to admit it. But let me just get into this video and explain to you what I'm talking about. At the core of all of this, to play football, you need talented football players. I don't think anybody would disagree with me when I say that the SEC has the most talented football players. They have the most blue chip players, they have the most talented football players, and year after year, they have the most players drafted into the NFL. So if you have the most players drafted into the NFL and you have the most blue chip players, that means you have the most talent. That's just how this goes. So the lower tier teams in the SEC can probably compete or beat all of the teams in every division's lower section. You don't believe me? Let me bring up my trusty iPad just to prove this point. So when I'm looking at this iPad, I'm going to tell you who is at the bottom half of the SEC. The bottom half of the SEC right now is Mississippi State, Kentucky, Auburn, and Oklahoma. The bottom four in the SEC right now is Mississippi State, Kentucky, Auburn, and Oklahoma. So the bottom in the Big Ten is going to be Wisconsin, UCLA, Northwestern, Maryland, Purdue. Do you think for 2 seconds that those SEC teams that I just named cannot beat those teams in the Big Ten I just named? If you think that they can, I don't know what to tell you, but you need to pay attention to what's going on. The next group is in the Big 12. The bottom of the Big 12 is Oklahoma State, Utah, Arizona, UCF, and Houston. Those are the bottom 5 teams in the Big 12. I can almost promise you that all the teams that I just listed in the SEC can beat those bottom tier teams in the Big 12. Okay, cool. Let me go to the ACC. The teams at the bottom half in the ACC this year are Florida State, Stanford, Wake Forest, North Carolina State, and Cal. Do you think for 2 seconds the teams that I just listed in the bottom of the SEC cannot beat those bottom ACC teams? Pay attention to what we're talking about here, people. Again, I always say this, get your feelings out of this. Pay attention to the football, just the football, and pay attention to the trenches alone. The trenches alone are going to determine a lot of these games. If you cannot dominate in the trenches, you cannot beat a team. That's just period. That's just how this goes. And when you look at the teams that are in the bottom tier of the SEC, and you look at the teams that are in the bottom tiers of all these other conferences, they are not the same. These teams are not created the same. So think about what I'm saying here, because this is going to prove the point that all of you are making over and over and over. And it actually proves the reverse point, but you don't realize it. You say, oh my gosh, these lower tier teams are beating these good teams. This lower tier Auburn is beating this higher tier Texas A&M. This lower team Oklahoma is beating this higher team Alabama. Okay, go with me here for a second. Put on those critical thinking brains. If a lower Oklahoma is able to beat a top tier Alabama, what that means is that lower team Oklahoma would run all over all these other lower tier teams in the ACC, in the Big Ten, and the Big 12, right? So if we agree to that point, then we are agreeing to the fact that the lower teams in the SEC are better than the lower teams in these other divisions. So therefore, if you lose to a team that is in the lower tier SEC and you beat a higher tier team, your loss is not going to harm you as much to where if you're in this bad conference and this bad lower tier team beats you at the top tier, then you've lost to a worse team. So if you compare across the board, a lower team in the SEC is better than a lower team in another conference. If you believe that to be true, then the committee got this right. I don't understand what isn't clicking. I know it doesn't feel good. I know it doesn't look good. I know you're so tired of the SEC biases. You have the same biases. Don't believe me? Do you want your team to play Georgia? Do you want your team to play this Texas team? Do you want your team to play Texas A&M? Do you want your team to play South Carolina? Do you want your team to play Tennessee? There's not a lot of teams in this country right now that would be excited to play a lot of these SEC teams. It just doesn't happen. You want to know why? Because we all know who is good at football. We all know. We can see it. We can see it. They're moving faster. They're bigger. It's a different football game. So don't convince yourself that it's not different when you absolutely 100% know that it is different. It is different football in the SEC. You know that. If it wasn't, all of these divisions would have more people drafted into the NFL than they do. They don't. The SEC is where the talent is. Not all of the talent. Some of it is sprinkled other places. But stop acting like a 3-loss Alabama is the same as a 3-loss somebody else. It's not even close. It is not even close. It is not close. Would you spend your last $1,000 and bet against a 3-team loss Alabama against any other 3-team loss in the country? I want you to put your comments in my comment section below and let me know if you would bet your last $1,000 that Alabama is a worse team than some of these other 3-team losses. Let me know. Lie to me in my comment section and tell me that you would make that bet. You wouldn't make the bet. It sounds crazy. It sounds crazy, but I know that it doesn't fit in our narrative when we're trying to get our team in and this and that and this and that. It's just not real. The other thing here I'm going to say, because I'm a Texas fan, hook 'em. So it is not my fault that Texas is beating these teams. It is not my fault that Texas beat Arkansas and Tennessee struggled with Arkansas. It's not my fault that Texas beat Kentucky and Georgia struggled with Kentucky. That's not my problem. It's not my problem that Texas beat Oklahoma and Alabama can't beat Oklahoma. That's not my problem. That's actually not my issue. Texas is taking care of business and doing what they're supposed to do. So you can't fault them for doing what they're supposed to do when these other teams are losing to these schools. Winning matters. Winning is important here. So let's stop acting like, oh, the SEC is not that great this year. The SEC is down. There's no dominant team. Your team isn't dominant either. Your team isn't even close to what these teams are doing. So let's stop acting like it's all the same thing. It's not the same. Your team that's lost 4 games is not the same as these SEC teams. Let's stop comparing them. That is a false equivalency. Let's not compare false things to each other. When you're complaining and when you think your team is just as good, or when you try to say all these things, it is actually not true. You're trying to convince yourself of something that's not true. And all the SEC does is get talent in there, develop that talent, and send that talent into the NFL. Not all the people go to the NFL. I'm not here saying they all go to the NFL, but the numbers tell you statistically more people go into the NFL from the SEC than all of these other teams or all these other divisions. It just is what it is. You can't argue with the facts. Just because you don't like the facts doesn't mean the facts are wrong. So I get it. We want to whine and complain about the college football playoffs, the SEC bias. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. It is what it is. They're better teams. They're just better teams. So even if you don't like it, doesn't mean it's not true. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's not true. I think the strongest case for the SEC being a better conference is actually that the lower teams are able to beat these higher seeds. I think that tells you everything that you need to know about this division. Now, a lot of people will be like, it's top heavy, it's this, it's that. I believe Mississippi State could give some of these lower tier teams in the Big 12 and the ACC and in the Big 10, I believe they could give them a run for their money. I believe if I got to watch a Mississippi State team play a Houston team in the Big 12, or play an Oklahoma State in the Big 12, or play a Stanford in the ACC, or play one of these lower tier teams in the Big 10, I think that Mississippi State team has a really good chance of winning, and Mississippi State can't beat anybody in the SEC. We'll never see it because Mississippi State is never going to make a bowl game based on this record. And neither are all these other teams that are doing worse in their conference. So we're never going to be able to see it. So we're never going to be able to test this theory. And that's why it's going to stay alive, because we won't be able to test it. And that is why we go round and round and round about this. But the one thing that we do know, the one thing that we can test are how many people get drafted. And year after year after year after year, more people get drafted in the SEC or from the SEC than any other conference. Let me tell you two things that I think is going to get interesting this year. What I think will be interesting this year is to see how many people get drafted from the lower tier teams in the SEC compared to the lower tier teams in the Big 10 and the ACC and in the Big 12. If come draft day, more people get drafted from these lower tier teams in the Big 12, the ACC, and the Big 10, as opposed to the lower tier teams in the SEC, people might have an argument, but we won't know that until we're able to see what happens, to see who actually has better players. The NFL is telling us everything we need to know. We just have to listen to what they're saying and see if those things can be true. So I'm going to be paying attention in May to see how many people get drafted that are from these lower tier teams and these lower tier conferences. Because if more people get drafted from the SEC, from the lower tier teams, that also will prove the whole point. I will end this video here and say one thing though. I don't understand the Boise State thing, because they are basically saying that all the teams that Boise State played are better than all the teams that the Big 12 plays. And you know what? I don't want to argue that here. I can't really debate it, but that's what they're telling you. It kind of is what it is. They're saying that they agree. That's what they think. And so I'm not here to debate that. I don't know, but I am here to defend the SEC. Yes, my Texas team is in the SEC, hook 'em. But I also just feel like the SEC is a better conference. That's why Texas wanted into the conference. We knew it was a better conference. We wanted the privileges. We wanted to play these people because we wanted the privileges. We all know that. Everybody knows that. That's how this works. This is how this has worked forever. So if you made it to the end of this video, thank you for making it to the end of this video. I would love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Let me know what you think about your biases with the SEC, because you have the same biases, but are your biases positive? Are they negative? How do you feel about it? Because the truth is, we all feel a certain way when it comes to the SEC. The question is, how do we actually feel? Are we feeling this way because we like the biases that we have, or are we feeling this way because we don't like the biases that we have? But at the end of the day, we all know what the gold standard is, and you can't argue that. No matter how it makes you feel, you can't argue that.